If we think of submerged cities lost beneath the waves, we're probably most likely to think of Atlantis, that thought experiment that took on a rather strange life of its own. Closer to home, there's the lost Welsh kingdom of Cantre'r Gwaelod, believed to lie between Ceredigion and Ynys Enlli. Yet there are countless tales of submerged villages along both the west and east coast of England too, not to mention villages lost to the depths of lakes or reservoirs. Many of these tales share a preoccupation with drowned church bells continuing to toll beneath the water. Others tell stories of losses often assigned to divine retribution. So how do these villages appear in folklore? Let's take a look in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you are well. Welcome to December. This is underwater month, so hopefully it will all go quite well. I know I said it'll all go quite swimmingly, but I decided to avoid that pun, but I went with it anyway, so there we go. We are going to have a look at submerged villages in this one, and I have talked about this in a little bit of detail in the Folklore of Churches episode, and I talked about the two different ways that villages can be submerged, where they either end up underwater or they end up almost swallowed by the ground in a sort of quicksand kind of situation. And it's always been something that's fascinated me, so I thought, well, let's have a look at the actual submerged ones anyway, and just sort of see what some of these legends are. Now, because some of the stories do reappear in different places, albeit in just slightly different versions, it's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. And obviously do remember, if you are interested in Atlantis, there is obviously that episode of Fabulous Folklore Presents where Sean took me through all of the weirdness involved with Atlantis, which I really highly recommend. But we're going to start off with submerged villages with a village in Cumbria called Torquin Tarn. And there is actually a ghost story associated with it of a woman who apparently met her end in the lake at the hands of her lover. But we're not here for ghost stories. There aren't any ghosts in this particular episode, you'll be pleased to hear, because we're actually looking at the legend of the sunken village punished by God for its cruelty. Now, according to the story, a wealthy town stood where the lake is now, which is about 9 miles east of Carlisle, and obviously there is the episode about Carlisle's legends. As you can imagine, since wealthy towns rarely fare well in folklore, the town gained a reputation for being cruel and greedy. God dispatched an angel to try to sort them out, and he adopted a disguise as a beggar. He went door to door begging for food, and found himself turned away at every house. Onlookers threw stones at him when he tried begging for help in the marketplace, and the angel decided to leave the town for a while and to rethink his strategy. But on his way out of the town, he met a poor widow. She invited him into her tumble-down cottage and shared the little food that she had. Her kindness touched the angel, but it also showed up the nastiness that he had experienced elsewhere. When he left her home, he asked God to punish the town and spare the widow. Soon a storm rolled in, battering the town with its fury. An earthquake tore open the ground and the town, with the exception of the widow's house, sank into the pit. The next morning the storm had passed and a beautiful 65-acre lake lay where the town once stood. People claimed that you could see the town at the bottom of the lake if you rowed out to the middle on a calm day. Now the story is, as you might imagine, just that. It is a story, because in reality Torquin Tarn was formed 10,000 years ago, and underground streams still feed it now because it's a glacial lake, not one created by biblical levels of punishment. I should point out that one of the slight downsides with that legend is the fact that there aren't any structures that people point to and go, that's the widow's house. But it's still a cool story though. But the idea of a city or village being punished by God for its sins is actually really common. I mean, obviously you've got the literal biblical versions of this, but the same origin story also appears for Somerwater in Yorkshire. In this version, the traveller is either St. Paul, Joseph of Arimathea, or Jesus, and only an elderly couple helped him. So when our intrepid traveller demands the punishment of the village, he asks that the couple be spared. Now, it is actually a really old story motif, obviously even before the biblical version, but we do find it in Greek mythology in the story of Baucis and Philemon. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but I'm doing my best. Now, in this tale, Zeus and Hermes are the deities who are turned away by townsfolk, and they're basically going from door to door trying to find out if their village is really as awful as it sounds. Also, remember, Zeus is the god of hospitality, so this is not really a particularly intelligent thing to do to turn him away. And basically, they get to the last house in the village, and only the elderly couple who live there show them any degree of hospitality. So Zeus and Hermes give them the chance to escape the town's fate. The couple do choose to ignore Zeus's advice not to look back at the deluge, but they are transformed into an oak and a linden tree, their branches entwined forever. And I do like that story, despite obviously the ending for the couple, but the fact that they are allowed to stay next to each other for eternity is quite nice. But this sort of belief in natural disasters actually being a punishment from God actually held fast for centuries, because even in 1703, Queen Anne ordered a national day of prayer after the Great Gale to try and avoid further punishing storms. Quite what you would make of some of the ones we've had in recent years is absolutely anybody's guess. And obviously I'm talking about UK storms at this point, and I'm thinking of probably the most notable one I can remember was Storm Arwen in November 2021. I kind of wonder what Queen Anne would have made of that one. There is, of course, a different type of divine punishment, and I wanted to have a look at the story of Urswick on the Lower Furness Peninsula in Lancashire. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, because in some parts of Northumberland, like a name like Urswick would be pronounced Urzik, and elsewhere it's Urswick, so I don't know which one's which, but there we go. According to legend, this is not the original village, after old Urswick sank into a lake. And much as we find in the Token Tarn tale, this story explains the creation of the lake as much as it does the loss of the settlement. Now in this story, the residents complained about the poor water supply and asked the vicar to resolve the issue. The vicar got them to form a procession to follow him around the church as he prayed. A stream sprang up in response to his prayers. Unfortunately, iron in the soil made the water flow red, and the women complained again. How could they wash their clothes in such tainted water, they asked. So they ordered him to pray again. Now the vicar wasn't particularly pleased with this turn of events, and he cautioned them against having to pray again. After all, God had answered his prayer. Asking again might seem ungrateful, and he didn't want to anger the Lord. So he made a bargain with the women. They should go home and consider his words for an hour. If they still thought he should try again, then they had to wave a white cloth from the window. If enough of them did so, he would try again. So an hour went by, and the vicar returned to the church, because yes, he saw plenty of white cloths at the window. So around the church he went, praying for a clean water supply. Now I'm sure he took no pleasure in being proven right, but a water supply did appear, this time in the form of a flood that swallowed the village. And apparently this explains why the waters of the lake in the area run reddish. And this is another thing that you get where there's some kind of origin story for a water supply, which explains some kind of feature about it. So this one, obviously the vicar tried his best, seems it wasn't good enough. Vaguely misogynistic, I guess, in a way, the fact that the women wouldn't accept what he'd done for them, but I suppose at the same time, would you want to wash white linen in red water? Probably not. Now we are going to go off to Shropshire for the Lake of Bomere, which boasts a legend in which an entire ancient city apparently lies below the water. Although it does vary, sometimes they just call it a village, other times it's a city. It depends on the version that you're looking at. And according to the story, the inhabitants refused to convert to Christianity. In some versions they were Saxon, in others they were Roman, and in other versions they had been Christian but then turned their backs on Christianity and took up the worship of Woden and Thor. The priest warned them no good would come of their behaviour, but they persisted, with the exception of a small band who continued to worship God in the chapel. One December, that had been far wetter than usual, the priest was gathering wood on the hillside when he noticed a problem. A dam held back the nearby mere, but the water was beginning to overflow. The priest ran down into the village, begging the men to cut a new channel to safely let the excess water out. But the villagers refused, as it was their winter festival, and they accused the priest of trying to spoil their fun. The priest gave up trying to help them and went to his chapel instead, and despite the rain, his flock gathered with him on Christmas Eve for their midnight mass. During the service, they heard an almighty roar before a mighty flood flowed into the church. It washed away the building, and the mere flooded the village, having breached the dam. People continue to claim that if you travelled over the mere on Christmas Eve, you could hear the church bell tolling just after midnight. But even better, if you missed that date, you can also head back on Easter Eve to see a Christian Roman apparently rowing across the lake in desperation, trying to rescue his pagan sweetheart from the water. That one's quite an interesting one because of the fact that the priest is included in the punishment as well. So unlike the earlier ones where somebody is spared because of the fact that they're somehow good or kind or whatever, in this case, the priest gets caught up in it as well. So I thought that was an interesting one. But then we also come to the idea of coastal villages. And obviously they kind of fare a little bit more differently because they're sort of at the behest of storms and so on. And according to records, a horrible storm struck the northwest of England in September of either 1554 or 1555. There's variations in which date it was. And a storm surge destroyed 12 villages between Carlisle and Southport, including 3 on the Filder Peninsula in Lancashire: Wadham Thorpe, Singleton Thorpe and Kilgrimwall. And I must admit, Kilgrimwall has the best name. It really does sound like somewhere that you would visit if you were playing World of Warcraft. But anyway, for 50 years after the disaster, people found coffins of decaying remains from Kilgrimwall's submerged churchyard on the beach after a storm. Now, no one actually survived the disaster at Wadham Thorpe or Kilgrimwall, although some people apparently did survive in Singleton Thorpe, and records seem to suggest that they moved 7 miles inland to Singleton. According to legend, the fishermen at nearby Fleetwood claimed to hear the church's bells tolling beneath the sea, but they would return to port if they heard them, considering them a storm omen. But Singleton Thorpe provides an interesting example because some people think that there actually was no lost village and it was actually just a farm or two. I mean, obviously that's bad enough, but it's obviously not the same as a village. And remains of buildings periodically appear at low tide on the beach, but the area is also referred to as Singleton Skier on maritime maps. Brian Hughes also points out that Thorpe usually refers to a hamlet belonging to a larger estate, which would suggest Singleton was the original settlement and Singleton Thorpe was in effect a sequel. So you wouldn't exactly move from Singleton Thorpe to Singleton unless Singleton already existed and you were just simply moving rather than setting up an entirely new settlement, if that makes sense. Now, it certainly seems that something was destroyed because obviously there is archaeological evidence of that, though the extent of it remains to be seen. Still, the fact that this became associated with tolling church bells beneath the waves ahead of storms shows just how pervasive the story motif actually is. And I wanted to also mention the lost town of Dunwich. And I know this does really sound like it could be an H.P. Lovecraft tale, but it does actually refer to a real port lost to the sea. So if we head to Suffolk, we'll find Dunwich between Aldborough and Southwold. You can go and visit because Dunwich is a village, and it boasts monastery ruins, a museum and a pub. Yet in the Middle Ages, the village was a busy port. Much of its religious patronage came via the Franciscan Greyfriars Monastery, founded in the 1250s. But in 1286, a storm overwhelmed the town, sweeping away the monastery and many homes. The ruins currently visible in Dunwich are from the rebuilt monastery dating to the late 13th century and originally built half a mile from the sea. The fact that they're now rather close to the cliff edge is a testament to coastal erosion. But following the loss of the town, a legend emerged that the port somehow remained intact underwater, albeit uninhabitable, and locals thought that they could actually hear the church bells ringing during storms, which, as I've said, is an incredibly common motif for these types of tales. In 1911, another storm saw sections of the cliff fall into the sea, taking with them remains of the church, and locals actually found human bones and ancient coins on the beach in the storm's aftermath, according to the Framlingham Weekly News. Now, historians assumed the legend to either be exactly that, a legend, or that anything that did remain would have long since broken up. But in the 1960s, fishermen started having problems with their nets snagging on something underwater. Since then, archaeologists have made surveys of the original Dunwich, which lies exactly where the old maps show that it was. And it must have been fairly large since it had 2 monasteries, 10 churches and a market. But unfortunately, geology was not on Dunwich's side. The northern part of the town lay next to the Dunwich River and it was on low-lying ground. The centre stood to the south on higher ground, but unfortunately the soil was largely made of sand and gravel. So storms would flood the northern part because it was low-lying, but then they would erode the sand and gravel soil under the centre part, so then that collapsed with the cliffs. And Dunwich just goes to show that these tales of sunken cities or lost villages aren't always necessarily only tales. Sometimes there can actually be some truth to them. Because speaking of which, in some parts of the British Isles there really are the remains of submerged villages lying underwater, notably at the bottom of reservoirs. Now, 2 of the more notorious are both in Wales. One of them is the village of Llanwydden, which lies at the bottom of Lake Vyrnwy after the nearby river was dammed in the 1880s to create a reservoir to provide water for Liverpool across the border in England. The dry weather in 2022 actually left the old Llanwydden visible because the lake's water levels dropped. History then repeated itself when the entirely Welsh-speaking village of Capel was flooded in 1965, again to create a reservoir for the benefit of Liverpool. Capel has of course taken on a much wider significance, as it should, because it does speak to a degree of bullishness on the English government side, the fact that they didn't actually consult the locals. But a persistent myth accompanies Cantre'r Water in Northumberland that abandoned villages lie at the bottom of the man-made lake, and I think there was 3 villages that were essentially flooded to create Cantre'r Water. Now, one legend actually even claims that the church spire still stands proud of the lake when the water level drops. However, according to Northumbrian Water, the myth is exactly that, because the buildings were actually demolished and the materials removed. So while there were houses and a school in the valley, you would never find any trace of them at the bottom of Cantre'r Water. So in conclusion, for whom does the bell toll in these submerged villages? Sorry, I was quite proud of that and I probably shouldn't have been. But the part that fascinated me about these particular legends is the bells ringing below water, because it doesn't seem to matter if the deluge that swept away the village left the church in ruins, because people still claim to be able to hear the bell. In some cases, the bell's actually removed before the village is actually flooded to create a reservoir, and people still say that they can actually hear the bells ringing. The bells almost haunt the area to remind people that the village used to be there, even if it no longer stands. And that the bells became a storm omen off Fleetwood also says a lot about the link that people then have between these lost churches and bad weather. I think the idea of the submerged villages being as a result of divine punishment is also an interesting one, because again it speaks to a very, very old story motif, and I think in some ways, even where in some cases there's no evidence of these whatsoever, which is what you tend to get with the lakes like Tochen Tarn, I think the fact that people use it as an origin story to explain the lake in the first place shows how deep rooted some of these story motifs actually are in the human psyche, as it were. And then I think obviously that's why there is the difference with the coastal ones, because the coastal ones usually did exist, although whether it was divine punishment or just simply the result of a storm, the stories do tend to lean a little bit more heavily towards it just being a storm, possibly because of the fact that they're more in living memory, or at least they were living memory at the time that the folklore and the legends were actually written. But I hope you enjoyed that. I haven't decided exactly what we're going to do next week yet. Obviously, don't forget the Loch Ness Monster is coming sometime this month, but I haven't decided at which point. It's like, do I do it before Christmas? Do I do it after Christmas? Who knows? Oh my god, I'm so sorry. I've just used the C word and I said it was going to be a festive free zone. I am really sorry about that. Either way, Loch Ness Monster is coming at some point. And there are also a few other water creatures which I haven't covered yet. So we shall see. Come back next week and find out what I've chosen to do. I do also want to say, and I keep forgetting to put this on the end of episodes because I'm an idiot, but I did also set up the membership option on Ko-fi. So at the moment you can buy me a coffee if you want to say thank you very much for all the podcasts this year or whatever. And I won't lie, I do actually spend the money on books instead, but they are books for the podcast. So if you do buy me a coffee, you are basically helping me buy research materials, which is really cool and very kind of you. Thank you very much in advance. But there's also a membership feature as well. And with that one, I have set it up so that you can pay £3 a month and you will only get the bonus episode from Patreon for that. So on Patreon, if you pay at the $3.50 a month tier, you also get a couple of additional bonuses. If you buy a membership on Ko-fi, you will just get the bonus episode. But I do realise that that might be easier for some people to set up, because I think it's just a PayPal or a Stripe payment rather than having to faff about setting up an account with Patreon. But there's that there as an option if you would like to support monthly, but you don't want to have all the faff of Patreon, then you can still get access to the bonus episodes that way. I do also have a shop on Ko-fi as well, and I do have some pre-recorded illustrated talks on there. So there's like Medusa, there's one on Ghostwatch, there's like how to ward your house, so it's like a Potterpake, witchcraft and things like that. I am going to hopefully record a couple of other ones over Christmas. It does seem that my pop culture ones seem to be the more popular ones, so I am going to see about doing my one on the medium in British horror films and how she's represented. I'm thinking about doing that one as well, and I'm sure I'll no doubt think of some of my other ones that I can go back and redo as well. But I hope you enjoyed all of that, and if I've gotten any of the pronunciations wrong, I do apologise. I do check them before I do them, but I can't always guarantee that what I've checked is what actually comes out of my mouth. So I do try, but there we go. Anyway, have a lovely week ahead, and I will see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.